At 2 o'clock on the afternoon of May 11th, 1896, a photographer named William Hayes hoisted a strange-looking camera up onto a tripod at the southern end of Herald Square. Passers-by assumed he was about to expose a glass plate negative. But the cumbersome apparatus, the latest invention of Hayes's employer, Thomas Alva Edison, did not take still pictures. Instead, exposing one frame after another, each just an instant apart from the next, 16 times a second, it was capable of capturing for the first time the speed and vitality of urban life.
People were terrified. When they first saw these images, they had no idea what they were. They had just brief 15, 30-second shots of things, but they hand-tinted some of them to be color. They did have this one film of a wall of water just rushing at you, and people got up in a panic and stormed out of the theater. I mean, just charged out of the theater because they thought that, you know, the wall had broken down and there was some kind of tidal wave coming through the wall.
Mesmerized by the kinetic energy of New York, the first cameramen carried their equipment everywhere, shooting short films they called actualities. Real-life views of actual places and events. Most had no plots and no characters, and most lasted only a minute or two. But audiences everywhere flocked to see them, enthralled by the spectacle of the city itself, which by 1900 had become the greatest show on earth. What the cameras revealed was a city that now had the world's busiest harbor, the world's biggest ships and longest bridges, the worst slums and grandest mansions. It had a statue 15 stories tall and a park 840 acres in size. It had trains that ran 100 feet above the ground and leapt across rivers. Though the films sometimes captured grand civic ceremonies and great public events, the most effective were those of daily life. Entranced, as Walt Whitman had been, by the humblest and most ordinary of moments. A trolley moving down the street. A windy day. A woman's smile. The new motion pictures conveyed, as nothing else had, the mystery and beauty and democratic glory of the modern world.
Motion pictures come into play, and they record the city, and they record it in such a way that make it even seem more exciting than it was. But certainly they capture the image of the city in motion as it had never been captured in the still photographs of an Underwood or Byron, who often had to photograph on a Sunday morning because the film moved so slow that if a cart moved by, you'd see it as a shadowy thing. Suddenly you catch that cart moving and see the New York traffic. And suddenly people become enthralled with what, in a certain way, they were rebelling against the 19th century. Traffic itself, density itself.
And yet, even as motion and change became a way of life in Manhattan, an even greater transformation was underway. Between 1898 and 1913, the human and physical and political landscape of the city would be transformed beyond recognition. During that time, the entire world would arrive on the city's doorstep, and most of those who came would be changed utterly by what they found there. But in the end, nothing would be more moving or prove to have more lasting consequences for the city and the nation than the changes the newcomers themselves would bring to the life of New York City. In little more than a decade, the 20th century itself would be born on the streets of New York, and nothing would ever be the same again.
Well, I think one of the great things about New York is it's not a static thing. It's not New York is. New York is always becoming. It's becoming physically as buildings are torn down and changed much more so than any other American city. But it's also always becoming in terms of what it is in something we can't see, in the culture of the city. So the immigrants came to New York City, especially in these large numbers between the 1880s and 1920s, and made it their own. Made it a kind of place that the world had never seen before. Made it where there were more Italians in New York than there were in Naples. I mean, there were more Irish than in Dublin. There were Greeks than in Athens. It was an incredible experience because the city was so vast and And so many of these immigrants were there that the city was open to these changes. So that even today, what is New York? It's more than a mosaic. It's a new kind of city.
If you were living in New York in those years at the turn of the century, you knew it was happening right there in front of you, in your village. And of course it disturbed many people. They didn't like it. They thought it was going to ruin the country, and they were wrong.
It began in the 1880s, spurred on by poverty and persecution, by financial panic and political upheaval, by family strife and personal woe. They came not from Northern Europe this time, but from the East and from the South. Italians, Jews, Greeks, and Poles, Russians, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Armenians, and Turks. Out of the remote and little-known reaches of Europe, one awestruck observer wrote, marches a vast and endless army.
It was a huge human tide, and coming on all the time, year after year, and growing. In 1907, 1,200,000 people, 1,200,000 people came into the city of New York, from Europe primarily. There were 289,000 of them from Italy alone, 256,000 from Russia, just in 1 year. And in the long run, they gave us more than they got.
One way or the other, they had all heard the same thing. There was freedom and opportunity in America for anyone willing to work. And the place with the most jobs was the sprawling, unfathomably large seaport of New York. For most, it meant leaving everything familiar behind.
The day I left home, my mother came with me to the railroad station. When we said goodbye, she said it was like seeing me go into my casket. I never saw her again. Yulia Goniprov, 1899.
There was a sense that the city, a message that the city whispered to its people and to people from all over the United States. You know, come here, everything is possible. Now, that's a seductive sound. It's a seductive whisper. Now, a lot of people failed at it, but at least the promise was there.
There's always been a feeling of promise in New York. And the promise is there because it is the entrance city. It's the beginning. But I still think of it as a city to which, as James Joyce said about his characters, here comes everybody.
About 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, we all got up. The whole boat bent toward her because everybody went out. Everybody. She was beautiful, with the sunshine so bright and so big, and everybody was crying. The captain came and said, "Please, everybody, we should move a little bit to the center." But nobody would move.
The thrill was unbelievable, but always the fear, because you have to go through Ellis Island. I heard all kinds of things that they would tell you on the boat. My God, I said, I hope they're not going to send me back. Joseph DeLacy.
For decades, immigrants to New York had come through Castle Garden, a ramshackle state-run depot at the foot of Manhattan. But by 1890, the one-time concert hall had been completely overwhelmed by the tidal wave of new immigrants. and work had begun on a massive new federal installation, far out in the harbor, on an abandoned ammunition dump called Ellis Island. On December 17, 1900, the massive complex of brick, stone, and steel was finally complete. Built to accommodate 500,000 people a year, it was soon handling twice that number, sometimes as many as 12,000 a day. In 30 years, 12 million people would stream through the great echoing registry room, hoping to find sanctuary and a new beginning in America. More than 4 million of them would settle permanently in New York, tripling its population in less than a single lifetime.
Immigration made us huge. You could never have bred yourself into 8 million people in 50 years. Immigration did it. It also made for an industrial city. People who were arriving were from the farms in the main, arriving here in curious reversals. It was when the wheat from Kansas began arriving in the Baltic that peasant population there became surplus. They turned around and arrived here.
On disembarking, the Pilgrims entered a vast, bewildering, impersonal machine, an assembly line for processing immigrants. With numbered tags pinned to their clothes, they were swiftly herded into long lines, then ushered inside the main building by harried immigration officials, who barked orders at them in dozens of different tongues. Inspectors were required by law to turn back polygamists, paupers, criminals, and the mentally ill, as well as anyone with a heart condition, or a physical disability, or a contagious disease. The inspections were brusque, irreversible, and carried out with astonishing speed. On the busiest days, the examiners had less than 6 seconds to detect any one of 60 conditions. The unlucky ones were swiftly removed from the line without explanation and sent to special examination rooms with chalk letters hastily scrawled on their coats. L for lameness, C for conjunctivitis, H for heart problems, X for suspected insanity. The examination for trachoma, an incurable disease of the eye, was particularly traumatic. Anyone infected was sent back. 25-year-old Fiorello LaGuardia, working as an interpreter on Ellis Island to pay his way through law school, never forgot the harrowing scenes that ensued.
Sometimes, if it was a young child who suffered from trachoma, one of the parents had to return to the native country with the rejected member of the family. When they learned their fate, they were stunned. They had never felt ill. They had never heard the word trachoma. They could see all right, and they had no homes to return to. Fiorello LaGuardia.
For the majority who passed the medical exam, the last hurdle was the registry room, where the final interrogation was held. The nearest earthly likeness, one man said, to the final day of judgment. In rapid succession, each immigrant was asked to state his or her name, place of birth, destination, and occupation, how much money he or she had, whether he or she had ever been in jail, or had ever been an anarchist. No immigrant's name was ever known to have been changed by the inspectors at Ellis Island, who merely confirmed information already before them in the ship's manifest. For 80% of the newcomers, the harrowing experience was over in 4 or 5 hours. And in the end, fewer than 1 in 50 were denied entrance to America. Without ceremony or congratulation, the new arrivals were curtly waved down a flight of stairs toward the exit, where, at a place called the Kissing Post, after separations that had sometimes lasted months or years, they were finally met by family and friends.
The Italian kisses his little children, but scarcely speaks to his wife. The Hungarian and Slavish people put their arms around one another and weep. The Jew of all countries kisses his wife and children as though he had all the kisses in the world and intended to use them all up quick.
Most of the immigrants quickly dispersed to distant towns and cities around the country. But for 1 in 4 of the new arrivals, the final destination was a 15-minute ferry ride away, on an island many of them would never leave again. On board the ferry, approaching the battery, they stood in wonder at the last and most extraordinary sight of all. An astonishing vision that seemed to corroborate everything they hoped the new world might be.
Everybody was looking at Manhattan, and I must admit, that sight I don't think I will ever forget.
I thought I was in heaven. My God, was this a city on earth or a city in heaven?